All right, welcome back, everyone. Another great episode, Beneath the Helmet, Season 3. I'm your host, Arjuna George, former fire chief turned coach, author, and now podcaster as well. So, welcome to the show. I got a great guest on the air today. He's a fellow podcaster as well, with Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, also an author of The Furnace of Leadership Development, and also the owner of Fire Officer Leadership Academy. Today, I got with me retired and former Battalion Chief Rick Davis.
It's time to ignite your soul and unlock your full potential. Join us on Beneath the Helmet, the podcast exploring firefighters' health and wellness. Hosted by retired Fire Chief Arjuna George, our podcast is the perfect place to start your journey towards becoming the best version of yourself. So come on, let's join the conversation and find out what sets your soul on fire.
Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you there, Chief George. Appreciate the opportunity to come on and chat with you here today.
Fantastic. So, Chief, tell us a little bit about kind of what drew you to the fire service and just kind of set the stage of who you are as a person and kind of where you are in this moment right now today.
Okay. I was drawn to the fire service at a very early age. When I grew up in southern New Jersey, down near the Delaware Bay. And when I was 3 years old, that's when I had my first ride on a fire engine on a Memorial Day parade. And that just drew me in. The following year, there was a large fire down on the Delaware Bay, and you could hear the trucks coming. And my dad would take me out to the side of the street, and they'd come by and wave at the guys, and they'd wave back to me. And went back in the house. My dad said, "Hey, I got something to give you." And he came back a little while after he'd been digging in some stuff, and he gave me his badge. He'd been a volunteer firefighter there in southern New Jersey in Cumberland County. And I still have that badge in a shadow box upstairs. My Aunt Phyllis was my dad's sister. She lived next door, and she worked at the local International Farmall dealership. And one of the guys that was there was a volunteer firefighter, Art French, or Frenchy, as he was known in town. And so he would send things home with Aunt Phyllis to give to me, equipment catalogs, stuff like that. And he'd make arrangements with my dad to get me down to the firehouse on their Tuesday night drills periodically. And then when my dad was home and the fire siren went off and we chased the trucks, you could follow them by the water spilled in the roadway.
Yep.
And my dad liked to drive over to Philly, and we never got out of the car, but we'd drive by firehouses. And so, I just had that deep-seated interest in, wanting to be a firefighter. And then it was spurred on even more in 1972 when NBC released a television show, Emergency. And then that was that same year. Matter of fact, yesterday was an anniversary of my dad's death, March the 9th. I came home from school and I found him on the floor. It was his fifth heart attack. There was no 911 at that point where we lived, and even our hometown, our fire company didn't have any EMS or ambulance. And so I did dial 0, and they came from a neighboring fire company. And when I watched them load my dad up into the back of the ambulance, I vowed, so I'm going to do this for a career. And I started hanging out at the firehouse when there was a call or on drills. And I know initially they thought, hey, everybody knew everybody in the town that I grew up with. They were probably wondering, what in the world am I doing there? And after a while, I kind of became a fixture. And that was about that same time, give or take a year or two, when Dennis Smith released his book, Report from Engine Company 82. And I could not put that book down. I loved it. And there used to be, I think it might still be around, a publication called The Visiting Fireman. And I got subscribed to that, and there was a list of firefighters and fire buffs around the world. And I've been collecting and trading stuff since I was 4 years old. And so they just continued to draw me in, draw me in. When I turned 18, I did two things on my birthday. I put in my application for the volunteer fire company, and I entered the delayed enlistment program with the Air Force. And so they brought me on the fire company. I wanted to be a firefighter in the Air Force, and I bawled off on the line garbage from the recruiter. I can't get you in now, but when you get to boot camp, they'll be able to switch you. That didn't happen.
Wow.
So, yeah, that didn't happen at all. I still remember this tech sergeant down there at boot camp when I said, "My recruiter told me you could get me in the firefight," and he looked at me and he said, "Son, you've been screwed. You know, pick a job." And so that's pretty much when I went to war with the Air Force, the fight to get into firefighting, and I did. I did. I got in. And I would have made it a career, but they was going to send me back to my original career field because of a shortage. I said, no way. And so I separated and went to work for them as a civilian firefighter and decided to go to college. Wasn't bright enough to figure out that I could do that at the same time as I was a firefighter. So I resigned from my job as a firefighter to go to college, ran out of money, wound up in the Marine Corps. as as a firefighter. I said, great, I'm back in it. And oh, it was maybe less than a year. And then the career planner came to me and he says, all right, Davis, he says, we've got too many corporals in crash crew. You got to pick a job. And so I was retrained in the aviation operations. Ultimately wound up in North Carolina. What was down there, I was introduced to who's now my wife. We've been married for a little over 30, well, about 37 and a half years. Now moved out to Loveland, Colorado, and got on the fire department here in Loveland and spent just shy of 30 years on the department and worked my way up through the ranks. My last 15 years was as a battalion chief. Most of that time was as on shift. I was the training chief for 15 months, and I had the opportunity and the privilege to run a number of programs in the department. My two favorite was the hazmat program and the wildland program, but I also had special operations team recruiting, health and wellness, and then various, other little odds and end programs that came up. And so it was during that time, my last year on the fire, actually my last 2 years on the fire department was when I started writing my book that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, The Furnace Leadership Development. And I started a business, but it wasn't the same name. I had it under a different name. Couldn't work it because, as you know, as a chief officer, your time gets drawn and sucked away in so many different places. But when I did retire in May of 2020, that's when I was able to work the business more. And then I also became a member of the John Maxwell leadership team. So it was February 2023. I changed the name too to Fire Officer Leadership Academy. And so I continue my love affair, my relationship with the fire service. And it's been great. As I mentioned, my wife and I have been married now 37 and a half years. And we have two daughters. One is living here at the house with us. Our other daughter, she's married to a career Air Force guy. And we got a dog. And so
Nice.
that's pretty much it there.
So when in your career did you kind of realize that leadership was something that really you were gravitating to? And when did you maybe realize that hey, I am a good leader? Is there a pivotal point in your life that kind of really shined through in your life?
I would say that and I had leadership opportunities when I was in high school. My junior year of high school, I was in a graphic arts program, and I learned how to run a printing press. And then in my senior year, it was my job to train the junior who was in the class. And that's where I started to see some things. I probably really didn't recognize it at the time, but what I did recognize is I enjoyed teaching, the other guy. And once I got into the Air Force, I saw, a wide variety of no leadership to leadership, and some great examples of leadership and some very poor examples of leadership. And it was the poor examples of leadership that really, were getting me frustrated. And when I went to the Marine Corps, I saw a night and day difference between the leadership training from the Air Force to the United States Marine Corps. in the Air Force, when I went to NCO, non-commissioned officer, NCO school, it the leadership, I don't even want to call it that. It was all filled with this humanistic nonsense of, I'm okay, you're okay, type of a thing. And then when I got into the Marine Corps, that's like, okay, it's the leadership traits and principles. It's leadership based off of character. And that's what truly resonated with me. And that's when I started to grasp what leadership was and how leadership need to be applied. And of course, the Marine Corps is a big organization as well. And as any organization, you're going to have good leaders and bad leaders, and I mean some tyrants that are out there. And unfortunately, one of my bases in crash crew, I was working for an absolute tyrant. And I couldn't stand the guy. But when they said there's too many firefighters, your rank, and I got moved into aviation operations, I had the opportunity to deploy with the 4th Marine Amphibious Brigade. And the officers that I was working with there, they were absolutely fantastic. I mean, just incredible examples of leadership and true leaders and how they treated us. And I would think that time period there was the pivotal moment for me, to where I really saw this consistency in good leadership. And then from that point there is when I started just getting my hands on things and reading about leadership. And so, yeah, that would be my pivotal point.
Love it. Love it. How would you describe leadership in one word or one phrase?
One word or one, I'm not sure I could describe it in one word, but in one phrase, leadership is about exerting a positive influence on others to accomplish the missions or the task.
Do you think it's lacking in the fire service right now for leadership? Where do you think those areas that we need to maybe tighten up or relook at? Anything there that's kind of sticking out for you in today's
I
leadership?
I got to ask what's going on the right side of the cab and the rigs. Where's the leadership at there? Here we are in 2025, and just on Saturday, and I was looking at some videos out there on social media, and I'm seeing rigs pull out of the fire station, and it's obvious that at least one, don't know how many, where they have 3 or 4 person crew, but it was obvious one was standing up in the back of the rig, putting his gear on. And, for all the hype that we talk about in the fire service about firefighter safety, cancer awareness, and I see this guy, standing up in the back of the rig. Where's the leadership in the front of that cab, Chief? That rig should not, that officer should never have allowed that rig to move until that guy was seated and belted in back there. And I'm still seeing videos too of, incredible. And I'm an aggressive firefighter. I believe in aggressive firefighting, but doing it smart and wise, using our brain up here between our ears. And some of the things that I'm still seeing that are taking place out there, I ask the question is, where is the leadership at the company level? Where's the leadership at the battalion chief level? And that's where I'm seeing gaps. And that comes back to the training. What type of training is taking place in the individual fire departments out there regarding leadership? Yeah, the NFPA's got their standards for the fire officer, and those are generalized anyway, and it really comes back down to the individual states, or in your case provinces, and or maybe even the nation, how things are lined out. But as I've looked at this over the years and continue to look at this and continue to study this, there's a lack of consistency in leadership training in the fire service. And it plays out all the way from, the firehouse, whether it's a volunteer organization or paid, uh, to the scene of an emergency. And I've seen this play out recently again. I was out in California doing a hazmat training. I have had conversations with a couple captains on, one of the larger fire departments out there, and I just ask, hey, what are you guys looking at becoming a battalion chief? No way. Don't want nothing to do with it. I said, why not? Well, I see my battalion chief, and I see we never see him unless there's a problem. He'll show up at the scene of a fire, and the captain, the first initial IC is overwhelmed. My BC will show up, and he won't take command. He'll just let the captain be overwhelmed, and then after a while, when he sees it might calm down, and just get on the radio and say, "Well, if you don't need me, I'm leaving." And there's a failure there further up the chain of command to address those type of deficiencies in battalion chiefs. So the conversation I had, it's really interesting. I had the conversation in December of 2022 with a captain from the same organization, and then a conversation with a captain in the same organization in December of 2024. And they didn't know each other because I asked a fellow this past December, did you know, such and such? Nope, don't know him. And so here we go. We got two guys, two captains, same organization. They don't know each other, but their response is the same thing. That's just, yeah, certainly it's just two guys. But when you got two guys that are saying the same thing and they don't know each other, it's like, okay, what's going on here in this organization? Where is the leadership training? Why are they allowing these behaviors to continue? So that's where I'm seeing the gaps and this lack of consistency in training that's out there. And then also, even when I was involved in fire officer academies here in our region, because it was done regionally, so many times it'd be a 2-week officer academy, and so many times, even before day one's over with, you probably got a third of the class saying, "Man, when are we going to get to the hands-on stuff?" Yeah, I get it. I like the hands-on stuff.
Yeah.
What's the percentage of time
Mhm.
that you actually spend on hands-on stuff? Yeah, we need to be proficient and efficient and professional. Absolutely. We have to. But there's failures that are taking places in the volunteer and the paid firehouses around the world because of a lack of leadership.
Kind of comparing that to your experience in the military, why is there a difference there? Why is it so much, clearer, more professional leadership that you saw and witnessed in the military than you are seeing in the fire service? What's the difference there? Why?
I believe the difference is in the military, it's established, through a process that has occurred over the years and still an ongoing process, as far as training is concerned. And I'm reluctant to say it's a thou shalt do, but really it is. I mean, you get to certain points and it's like, okay, you have to go to, this type of training, and it's going to come. Whereas, in the fire service, uh, unless maybe we were working in the United Kingdom where things, the government is set up a lot differently, and they're mandating more than what takes place here, is that, well, I'll narrow it down to the state of Colorado. The qualification, the certification system here in the state of Colorado, it's voluntary. Now our department followed it, and the departments in our area follow it. But there are smaller fire departments out in eastern Colorado, southeastern Colorado. For example, I had a just random phone call from a fire chief in a small town out in southeast Colorado. It was about 10 years ago. And they were having problems with dopers out there, the tweakers stealing the anhydrous ammonia. And I don't know how, he came across my name someplace because I'd been in charge of the hazmat team and was doing hazmat training. And so when I got talking to him, and I was asking him about even basic firefighter one training, hazardous materials operations level training, it was, what are you talking about? I said, what do you mean, what am I talking about? I said, are you aware of the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control? And so none of them on this volunteer fire department were certified. And so that when we see these things, and I know that there's other states that it's mandatory, the firefighter certification trainings are mandatory. But when we get into the things regarding leadership and communications, personnel issues, how to write evaluations, those type of things, there's a lack of consistency. Whereas coming back to the military, it's laid out. Now, Chief, I'm talking about an overall big picture because I certainly don't want to come across with the image that every fire department is like that because it is not. The one that here in Loveland, no, we had things lined out, with a qualification system. So the area departments, I know there's bigger departments in the country and up in Canada that have those things lined out, but then there's others, and not always the bigger departments as well, but it's that lack of consistency that occurs on the civilian side to where on the military side of things, this is the training that you are going to get.
And from experience, and I'm sure you would agree that a lot of this misalignment, inconsistent leadership also creates toxic cultures, toxic workplaces. And you talk about in your book the organizational monsters, essentially, right? Of how to handle them.
Yeah.
Dysfunctional. So how would you, for the listener right now, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's walked into a dysfunctional, toxic organization, maybe as a chief or a chief officer, captain? What's about some of the best techniques or tips that you could share to help kind of navigate those first 90 days?
I'll go back before they even get hired because I work with a lot of people who are interested in becoming firefighters. And when I sit down and I talk to them, I ask them, where do you want to work? And they might list off one or two departments or, hey, I just want to get hired someplace. And so what I do with them is I put them through a core values exercise because most they don't know what their core values are. And this thing takes, 8 minutes maximum. Identify their top 3 to 5 core values. And then I also use the DISC behavior assessment, the dominant, influencing, steady, and then the correct. And the report to get back from the Maxwell team is 30 pages. So I'll take that and I'll marry that with their core values. And we'll point out their strengths, their communication style. And then I'll say, you take this stuff and do your research. I said, don't just buy off on what's on a fire department's website. I said, it's too easy to say this is our mission, vision, and values. I said, you need to dig in, get into that fire department and find out what is the true culture of that organization. And I said, that's only going to come about by getting in there. If they allow ride-alongs, do ride-alongs, listen to the comments that are being made by the crew. Are they constantly complaining? Or is there one of the crew members who's constantly complaining and the officer just sits back and doesn't do anything about it, doesn't address the issue? Or is it a department that is complaining about the chiefs? You need to listen to these things. Or are they talking about, the good things of the department? Are they talking about, how good the culture is of the organization? Look at their morale, observe that. So that's where it's important right there for the people coming into the fire service. Somebody who's doing their research and they're finding out these things ahead of time, they can probably, and I'll explain why I say probably in a moment, they could probably avoid that toxic culture that you're talking about. Now, with that being said, here's where the probably comes in the play. Depending on the size of the department, there's always that 1 to 2%, and sometimes might be more, but there's always 1 to 2% of people are disgruntled. Yeah, the disenchanted, the disgruntled, people that if the chief of the department sent out an email and said, guess what? Everybody's getting a $15,000 a year pay raise effective April 1st. there'd be 1 to 2% of the department say, "How come we didn't get $16,000?"
Yep.
So, dismissed, just dismissed, that right there. But listening, to the culture and how are they perceived in the community. There's a fellow named Jeff Henderson, and he wrote a book called For, FOR, and it's really a simple book. What do you want to be known for, and what are you known for? Which is the two vastly different areas. So now let's just say, our firefighter, Joe Schmuckatelli, one of my favorite characters in my book there. Joe Schmuckatelli's on the department and he gets stuck with, a bad crew. Well, we know that the brotherhood, sisterhood culture of the fire service can be very oppressive at times. It could be great. I that's one of the things I miss about being retired is the camaraderie, that we had here at Loveland Fire Rescue. And but somebody gets into that bad situation, how do they handle that? That's going to take a lot of courage on their part. And in the Marine Corps, we define courage as the mental and physical control of fear. And some of this stuff even includes, hazing. And we've seen the stories pop up over the years about how hazing has gone, over the top in departments and has led to, people being fired or multi-million-dollar lawsuits and things like that. So the firefighter or whoever it is that they're stepped up on that toxic environment and it's not changing, it really has to come down to the fact that they got, number one, they got to start talking to their company officer, starting right there. I mean, that's just the ethical thing to do. And when I took over as a battalion chief, I got promoted to battalion chief. I told my shift, I said, because we for a long time, we had a real problem with chain of command issues. People who were right straight to the fire chief and complain about things. And I told him, I said, if you're going to come to me and complain about your engineer or your officer, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you talked to them? And if you say no, I'm going to say, well, what's preventing you from talking to them? Yeah, what is there a fear there? Have they threatened you or anything like that? And I said, I'll give you advice on how to talk to them. I said, but unless there's some type of a physical threat, they've threatened you. And I said, that'll take it down a whole different path. I said, I expect you to be adult enough to address it. So that's that first step that I recommend. And then if that doesn't correct it, then have to further that thing up the chain of command. I would say, please don't be the person that wears your emotions on your sleeve. That somebody says something, and I've seen this play out, that something is said in the firehouse, and instead of two adults having a conversation, Bill says something to Ed. Ed doesn't like it. And instead of Ed, having the courage to talk to Bill about it, Ed picks up the phone and he calls HR. And then the next thing you know, there's an investigation that's taken place. And so many problems can be eliminated with those one-on-one conversations. It's tough. It is. It is, Chief. And I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that it doesn't matter, paid or volunteer, in that tight-knit community, that taking an issue up to a company officer or a chief officer can get people branded. But the question that I would have for somebody that's in that position, do you want to walk through life being miserable and possibly even quitting the fire service because you don't have the courage to address the issue? And sometimes, and I'm sure you've seen this as a chief officer too, is the people in the ranks make the assumption that we know everything.
Yes. We feel we need to as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I've
need.
had people come to me, well, did you know that this was going on? No, you didn't? Well, no. And I have not developed that level of ability to be able to read people's minds and things like that. So it comes, that communication issue. It's tough. It is absolutely tough. So I encourage anybody who's listening here, or you know somebody that is in that position, they got to have the courage to be able to address it and address it appropriately. And don't use somebody else as your sounding board. If you're being threatened, that's a whole different line, totally different legal line.
100% agree.
Mhm.
What's your thoughts on like emotional intelligence as a leader, or what would you say is some of the biggest virtues that you would love to see in our fire service leadership?
Yeah, emotional and social intelligence. Looking at the people coming into the fire service, we've got a wide range of ages. Yeah, and we've got people coming out of high school and they're going to community college, maybe getting a certification, and they're getting onto a volunteer fire department or getting hired someplace, and definitely a lot smaller rural fire departments are bringing in a younger, could be bringing in a younger demographic, and people who have not always been exposed to working out in the world. What I had seen, working in the fire academies, is the people that were more grounded were those who fell into two areas, those who had been in the military and those who had been involved in team sports, where they were used to working with a team and they understood the dynamics of that, and they had not always, but they had a better understanding of how to work with people. And how do we speak to each other? And that the emotional intelligence, social intelligence, uh, for on the paid side, can be locked up in a firehouse for a long time with each other. We went to the 48, 96-hour shift, and that's a long time. And if there's overtime that gets coupled into it, then we bring in the stress of, from the volunteer side, they might be working all day or working shift work. And then there's the expectation that they meet X number of drills a month, X number of meetings a month, X number of calls, either a month or a year. The strains that come in on the family on the paid side. Somebody's got something planned tomorrow morning and they get mandoed, at 6:30 in the morning. And, the wife is, ticked off about it. Or in one case, I had a guy, he had said, "Man, Chief," he says, "I'm looking forward to tomorrow. It was Father's Day." He's like, "I get to play golf with my dad." He'd been in the Marine Corps and he'd been deployed over in Iraq. And he said, "I haven't been able to play golf with my dad since before I was in the Marines." Guess what happened on Father's Day morning? I had to mandatory him. And so, these tensions that get created now slop over in how we interact with each other. How do we communicate with one another? We talk a lot about, communicating on the radio and making sure that we speak clearly enough so that we can understand each other. But do we talk about communicating with each other in the firehouse?
Oh,
No,
huge gap, huge
no,
gap.
no. Yeah, no, not at all. And from the, so that's part of that emotional intelligence. And is how are we communicating with each other? From the social intelligence side, I'd say probably, most firefighters are good out in the public. They go out to the schools and do pub eds, or, visitors come in and things like that. But then again, do we exhibit that same level with each other in
Oh, it's
the
so funny,
fire?
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's really odd. And, because of the type of people that are drawn to the fire service, type A personalities, go, 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 let's get it. Let's break down the door. Let's pull the hose, that type of thing. And, that stuff, man, it plays out certainly at that emotional and social level within, and again, both sides of the house, paid and volunteer.
Do you think it's the roadblock there? What's holding us back from communicating better as a group to each other? Maybe conflict resolution, or maybe just even just dialogue, get to know each other that much deeper. What's stopping us?
Maybe we should take a look at how we term these things. As we talk about hard skills and soft skills. And over the years, I've heard people, take anything related with leadership, communications, and well, that's a soft skill. Oh, baloney. Yeah.
I hate
Leadership's a
that word
hard
for
skill.
one. Yeah, I hate
Yeah.
that word for one.
Yeah.
Soft sounds, yeah, it's terrible, terrible name.
Yeah, it sounds terrible. And so for somebody who's coming into the fire service, a man or woman who's coming into the fire service, soft? I ain't soft. I don't want to hear nothing about soft skill. And it's like so number one, we need to start letting people know, hey, leadership and communication is hard. These are hard. These are hard skills. And communication is something that, yeah, we're born and we start babbling. And eventually we start forming words and sentences. And yeah, but that doesn't mean that our communication is effective. One of I had mentioned that I was on the John Maxwell leadership team, and Maxwell, he's got two books on communication, and they're fantastic books. One is Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. And the other one is the 16 irrefutable, undeniable laws of communication. That's his newest one right there. And this is material that ought to be circulating in the fire service. And so we know we can communicate with each other better. I had mentioned the disc that have access to, and it focuses a lot on communication styles, how to communicate with each other. And so getting rid of that terminology of soft skills nonsense and just saying, hey, we need to be able to function at a professional level, and we need to communicate with each other better. And so we're going to learn this. Nobody comes into the fire service knowing how to do everything that there is. And it's the same thing with communication. I think so many times there, Chief, that we make this assumption that just because we're talking, that we're actually communicating with people, and we're not.
I agree. Yeah, the hard soft, I despise that terminology. How I look at it is this: the hard skills, which is like the hands-on, breaking doors, stretching lines, and then the harder skills are those ones, communication.
Absolutely. And I really saw that much more clearly when I became a battalion chief, because there were some guys on the departments, man, they were solid firefighters, a solid company officer on the Fireground. And when you're a peer and you don't get to see what's going on in a firehouse over on the southwest side of town, but you run a call with them, and you can trust your life with that guy, and that he's going to make good decisions. But then when you become a battalion chief and you get to see the behind the scenes now in the other firehouse, it is like, so that's what's going on in that firehouse over there. This guy is absolutely fantastic when the bells hit and pulls up to whatever it is. But inside the firehouse, he's not leading the crew.
Mentioned the word grounding before as a leadership kind of trait. I don't think a lot of people talk about grounding as a leader. How would you describe that, and why is it important?
My grounding comes back to the foundation. And, the first chapter in the book is on integrity. And I think that's where the grounding begins. And, we could jump on the news, whatever we think of in news media, and we can look at stories that pop up around the world, and they deal with a lack of integrity. But let's narrow this down. When we finish here, I'll check my email, and I'll either have the daily news feed from Firehouse magazine or Fire Engineering magazine. And I'm appalled at some of the things that take place in the fire service. When we see that there's sexual misconduct taking place in the firehouse, when we see that there is cheating taking place, and it's been done by, training chiefs, and we see, financial improprieties taking place. And these type of stories and others, these type of stories, pop up way, way too often. That's a lack of integrity. Those are character issues. And I'm a firm believer, Chief, that if somebody is not firmly grounded in integrity, I don't care how great they are operationally. I don't care how great a paramedic they might be. I don't care if they're a hazmat technician and they've got the periodic table memorized up here in their brain, or how strong they are. Uh, You know, if they don't have integrity, uh, there's issues. There's issues, and sooner or later it's going to pop up in one manner or another. And how many times have we've heard in our career somebody say, "What you're doing, would you want it on the front page of the newspaper?"
Sure.
And yeah, that's a very simple question, but I think that us in the fire service all too often don't think that way. So that's what I mean by the grounding, is that integrity, and it,
Yeah,
and
I
it
like that.
builds in there. John Wooden, the basketball coach at
Yeah,
UCLA.
love him.
Yeah, I've got a couple of his books, yeah, and he's got that pyramid,
Pyramid of
that's in
success.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and really, when we look at these things, and well, let's just talk about Wooden. You look at his pyramid of success, and it looks simple. Yeah, it's simple on paper, but it's extremely difficult to engage.
100%. Yeah, I love John Wooden stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
classic. So, kind of for grounding for people, because I don't think grounding's a common term in the fire service.
hmm
I think it's a huge, important kind of characteristic or trait for a leader to have is to be able to ground themselves. But I'm assuming this is kind of like your North Star, right? When you're
hmm
going through some sort of thing, you're like, all
Yes.
right, I gotta look at this to redirect
hmm
me and bring me back to yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Core values.
Yeah.
What are those top 3 to 5 core values that we hold that we're not going to compromise on? And I'm not talking about, hey, growing up in New Jersey, I'm kind of a pizza snob. So I'm not talking about, hey, we're going to go get pizza and okay, well, all right, you guys all want to go to Pizza Hut. So I'm going to compromise my pizza values and go to Pizza Hut. You know,
Yeah.
it's something it's much deeper, that who we are, that where we really are grounded. And I just had an example from the hazmat world, uh, that maybe people can relate to listen to this, is that grounding and bonding. Before transferring, flammable or combustible liquids, we're going to ground or bond. And it's important. And where I really had that illustrated was back in early 2002. I had the opportunity to go to a rail car specialist class at the big facility down in Pueblo, Colorado. And the instructors there were teaching us about grounding and bonding. And it's like, wow, we've been doing it wrong. And so when you look at the correct way to ground and bond, transferring flammable combustible liquids so you don't get a static charge, maybe having to go out and just drive that rod into the ground, drive that rod into the ground where it's not going to move and it's hit something solid. And that's what we need to be doing with our character. It's like stand on our character.
Love that. Yeah, such a critical thing. We hire for skill so much, and
hmm
sometimes I think we need to, well, all the time actually. I think we need to be hiring for character and then
Yeah.
train them.
Yeah. Yeah, we can train for the skills. And that story that I have in there about organizational monsters, that all stem back to hiring practices.
So when you have such clarity on your values, integrity, and such, it's very easy to have some moral injury impacted on you, especially as a chief and a leader,
hmm
where people maybe go against what your true North Star is or your values. Did anything like that ever happen in your career where you were like, it actually made an injury in you and actually affected your morals, your spirit, because it went so deeply against what you stood for as a person?
Yeah, it's a sad thing. what you're talking about there when we stand on our values and then something occurs organizationally that it are you kidding me? That response right there. Are you kidding me? And we had an instance, I should say. I believe it was back 1996 or 1997. And an individual that I had really looked up to in the department uh, took part in a deception. And it really struck me to the core because of how I had viewed him and how I had admired him. And when I saw him compromise that, and I talked to him about it, and his response is, well, I don't agree with it, but the chief tells me I need to do this. That there's a lack of character right there. Is it's wrong, then we need to stand for it. Um, period. It comes back down to that moral courage. And as we go up in the ranks, as I go up in the ranks, is yeah, and there's times, and here it comes down to, and we've heard this for years, well, when we leave this meeting, we all need to be on the same page, and whether we disagree or not, we all need to be on the same page. I don't agree with that. That because that comes down to is like if something is taking place in the organization that is illegal, immoral, unethical, and then for me or anybody else to agree to that, now we become complicit. So we have to make a decision that that no. And when you and I were on a couple weeks ago, and I brought up the thing that happened in 2020, with the mask mandate and how that was handled in the organization. And if we're going to talk about unity at a command level, then it needs to be practiced. And when that is violated and a decision that impacts the entire department, everybody, every last man and woman in the organization, and we're talking about command staff unity, and command staff is not included in that discussion, yeah, that falls into that category of what you are talking about right there. Is I view that as a violation of ethics, and I find that as a violation of organizational ethics as well. If we're going to say we are this, then we need to do that.
Stings. It stings when it's goes against who you are as a person, right? Your character,
Yes.
what you stand for. It really stings.
Yeah. And I've had it happen outside of the fire service um, as well. You know,
So for the listener listening right now, kind of studying leadership, learning about how they can be a better leader, a better person, a better firefighter, what would be your one message to send to the listener today to spark some interest in them to say, hey, I'm going to look into that a little deeper and I'm going to see how I can implement that into my life? What would be that one key message?
be a student of leadership. Be a student of leadership. Be thirsty for it, and don't accept status quo out there. For years on my fire department here in Loveland, there was no corporate level leadership training until 2009 when we hired a chief from a neighboring department. So prior to that, everything that occurred with me on a leadership level was initiated by me. And I had to fight my way into the officer development program at the Rocky Mountain Fire Academy. It was a year-long program, and it was modeled after the executive fire officer program back at the National Fire Academy, but a much scaled down version. And I had to fight my way into that. And so anything that I was doing from a leadership perspective was something like that. going out, doing it on my own, buying my own books, subscribing to the magazines on my own. And there's an attitude, Chief, that exists with too many firefighters. And it's like, is the department going to pay for that? Am I going to get overtime for that?
Yep.
That's like, hey guys, pull your head out of your rear end. You know, and I would look at the people on the shift or on the department, and I would watch the ones who stepped beyond that level, the ones who were committed to improving themselves. Personal and professional improvement means that we go beyond asking the fire department, are you going to pay this? Are you going to pay me to do this? That's the exceptional firefighter, the exceptional officer who is willing to do that. Who they are the true student of leadership. And they're looking at these things, they're getting their hands on things, and then also don't just confine it to the fire service. That's a family tree that's up and down. There's so much that is out there beyond the fire service that we need to learn from that we can bring back into the fire service. If you could see the rest of my what I call my command post down here, the books that I have. Yeah, I came out of the military. My family has been involved in the military down here ever since it was the British colonies. And so I love reading military history. But we mentioned John Wooden, Vince Lombardi. I've read about him. And another, this fellow that I mentioned, Jeff Henderson, John Maxwell. Every morning, there's a guy called Darren Hardy. He was the editor of Success Magazine, the Darren Daily. Yeah, it runs anywhere from 4 to 7 minutes. These things that we can engage ourselves in, that firefighters can engage yourselves in. And listen, folks, I know there's budget times that are hard. We're experiencing that here in my own city when food tax was eliminated. And so what's the first thing that gets whacked? Training. Yeah, but it still needs to occur, and we as individuals can pursue that personal and professional growth. Yes, I know very, very well that there are certain things out there that from a financial standpoint and then also from a legal standpoint that we can't go to. And what I mean by that is like, the National Wildland Coordinating Group, they got their S classes. That's, the Sawyer, the Saw class. I would have guys come to me and I said, well, we don't have the money in the wildland budget to send you this year. Well, I'll just pay for myself to go. No, you don't, because that falls into a different category. Because if you go, you pay for yourself, you get hurt, you're going to be in the hurt locker with the legal department, HR, and the fire department. So to those type of things that, yeah, I understand that you can't pay for that yourself because there's too much resting on that. But attending a leadership course, going to a class on how to communicate better, those are things that we can do on our own.
A lot of it you can do for free, honestly. Like a lot
Yeah,
of it
yeah.
through podcasts, YouTube, books, articles on the internet. It's like there's a wealth of knowledge out there that's
Oh,
people are sharing for free, right? So
there is. My weekly blog posted at 0500 this morning on my website, and it'll post at 0500 on my LinkedIn profile. And I don't charge anybody for that. And is there a lot of work that goes into it? Yeah, absolutely. I've been writing these things for 5 years. So to your point, yeah, there's plenty of free resources out there.
switching gears a little bit, I want to dig
Mhm.
into a couple of your things. So your book, your podcast, and your new business. So your
Uh-huh.
podcast you do with your daughter. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how did that come to fruition?
Well, conversations. Why don't you do a podcast? Why don't you do a podcast? So back in, let's see, 2023, a friend of mine, not in the fire service, we go to the same church, and he's a single guy, and I've been mentoring him. And he says, one night we're out having supper. He says, "Hey, Rick, what do you think about us doing a podcast together?" I says, "Sure. What do you think?" Yeah, and he threw out some ideas. Well, it didn't come to fruition. And he's a CPA, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't have done a podcast together. But what it boiled down to is our personal interests were completely opposite. Uh, He likes classical literature. I hate it. You know, and so there was things like, even though I mentor this guy, we get along great. It would not have worked with a podcast. So that fizzled. And it was later on that year, my daughter Emily, she said, "Hey, Dad," she said, "what do you think if we did a podcast together?" And she had a doctor down in Austin, Texas, and that doctor does a podcast with his sister. And Emily said, maybe we could structure it that way. She said, "You've listened to his podcast before." I said, "Yeah, I have." So we just sat down and we hammered things out. And bang, our first episode released in February of 2024, Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, Igniting Leadership Excellence. Where did the Jersey Rick thing comes from? That was a nickname that the guys gave me here at Loveland Fire Rescue. And the credit to the logo, it's got New Jersey on it, and that fire engine that's in the logo was the first fire engine that I rode when I was 3 years old. And there's a lieutenant here at Loveland Fire Rescue, Matt Hensman, and he does graphic art and he does fantastic work. You know how it is. Yeah, you need something done, somebody someplace in a firehouse or another firehouse someplace, they know how to do it. It's one of the
100%.
great things at a job. So that's how it got birthed. And Emily and I have talked about this, and we're looking at later on this year, not every podcast, but most likely it would be every other podcast, bringing on a guest. Which when we move that way there, Chief, I'd love to have you come on,
Yeah,
pick
that'd be
your
great.
brain, as
Sounds good.
well. Yeah,
Love it.
and
Love it.
yeah, so
Podcasting is such a great way to get information out, have good
yeah,
conversations, maybe enlighten somebody who's listening right now going, oh, I never really thought of it that way, right? So
yeah.
really
The
amazing.
blog, the blog came about from after I started my business and digging more into business aspects of things. And it's like, hey, it's a great way to get your name and your business out there. And so that's how that came about. I think you've probably seen some of those weekly videos that I do. I post up on Facebook and then also on YouTube, usually related to the job, or leadership, something along that lines. The book was a long time in coming. My wife had encouraged me for quite a few years. You ought to write a book. You ought to write a book. Then as my daughters got older, same thing. And then when I was battalion chief, and I believe in going out to the firehouses. And that's something that one of your guests emphasized, Chief Lieb from FDNY. He talked about the chiefs getting out into the firehouses. I loved that. We talked about that here a couple of weeks ago. And just as a side note for the chiefs out there, when you say you're too busy to get into the firehouse, you'll regret that. You could put out a lot of them little brush fires by being in the firehouse. But at any rate, so that's what I would do. And my battalion chief would show up out at the station, come in, he'd had the mail. He said, "I need to talk to you out front." Well, he wanted to go out front because he needed to smoke a cigarette. And then he'd complain. He'd complain. It's like, sometimes I thought, hey, I need to get me a little white collar here. I felt like I was the guy's priest or something. You know?
Confession time.
Yeah, but I'm glad he had that trust in me. We'd known each other ever since I'd come on the department. We were peers, and he promoted up ahead of me. So from that side, it's like, well, I'm glad he had that trust in me. But on the other side is like, hey, Chief, you need to come in here and sit down, have a cup of coffee with us and talk to us. So I had vowed, it's like, if I ever get promoted to that rank, I'm going to go out into the firehouses. And I did. And that's one of the things I loved. Sometimes I'd pass on information, from our chiefs meetings when we had that. But the bulk of the time was out in the stations, getting to know the guys, just ad hoc training and mentoring. And then here's where it happened. I started hearing, "Hey, Chief, you need to write this stuff down." And I heard it again. "You ought to write this down. You ever done a book?" And it was back in 2017. My wife and I were sitting around the living room on a Wednesday night. And I'll tell you here in a moment why I remember Wednesday night. And we were talking about the book again. And my wife said, yeah, I remember hearing an interview on the radio not too long ago, a lady down in Denver that helps people, publish a book. And I said, oh, really? And I said, you remember her name? And she came up with a couple of different versions. And I jumped on the internet and I said, Polly Latovsky? She said, yeah, that's her. My Word Publishing. I said, oh, so we were talking about it. She had an events tab. And I went and I looked. I said, hey, she's doing a lunch and learn down in Denver tomorrow called Self-Publishing 101. Bang. That would have been a Thursday when we had a Chiefs meeting, but it had been canceled. That's how I remember it was Wednesday and Thursday. And I said, let's go. So I, jumped on there, signed us up, paid for it. We went down. I met, there's maybe about 15 people that were in there. Met Polly, met a lady that was working with her, Susie Schaefer. And after they were finished with the lunch and learn, my wife Deb and we was talking to Polly and Susie, and Chief, man, it came like bang, 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 bang. Almost it's like a whirl. Next thing I know, see you later. We're out in the parking lot. I look at my wife. I says, "Guess I'm writing a book."
Awesome. That's awesome.
That's how that came about.
Very nice. How long did it take you to write?
I started the actual writing in September of 2017. I finished the writing in, I think it was about March of 2019. I never wrote while I was on duty. And when I had on call, because we as the battalion chiefs, we had to perform on call duty. And when it was my turn, we share it with, we had a mix of captains and lieutenants on the shift. So the captains also had to pull on call. So when it was my turn to do on call, I didn't write. I never wrote the day after I came off duty. And so, narrowing it down to my writing time, it extended that back out. And then going through the editing process and everything like that. And I was working with Susie Schaefer. Her business is finished the book publishing. She had to move back out to California, and Polly helped her start her own business. And so because I'd been working with Susie, I stuck with her. So she took care of all the stuff on the back side with the Library of Congress, the ISBNs, Amazon, all of that, getting things lined up. I had a fantastic writing coach. She's down in Denver. Alexandra O'Connell's her name. She's a Jersey girl. So, I mean, we clicked and she understood my sense of humor. And Polly was supportive, even though I had gone with the suit. Matter of fact, Polly said, hey, Rick, I don't know anything about your project. So if you decide to go with Susie, it's not going to hurt my feelings. Polly came to the book launch. And so Susie took care of all these other things, and it was fantastic. So we actually had the launch party on November 2nd of 2019. It was in the paperback, was an ebook. And then was it last? Yeah, last year. Last year I worked with a lady here locally and did the book audio, and I narrated. I narrated that, so it's also an audio book. And to answer the question that and I was interviewed here last week by a lady down in Denver that I've gotten to know. She's in the publishing world, and it's like, when's your next book? And I get asked that. I suppose you get asked that question too, being an author. And my answer is, I don't know. There's a lot that went into it. Financially, there is a lot. And so I just don't know. I have a couple ideas, but I just don't know.
I think there's so many people that, well, I get approached, I would say on a daily basis. Give me a little tip on how to write a book. Like, where do I start? Where do I start? Because there's so many listeners, I think, right now who has a story within them, right, that they want
Yeah,
to share with the world.
yeah, absolutely.
You have a word of advice for somebody who's listening right now? Is like, I have a story, but I don't know I'm not a writer. What do I do?
Sit down at the computer, open up a Word document, and just start typing. And don't worry about what anybody else is going to say, because there's always going to be some jerk out there who's a naysayer. Yeah, why are you doing this? Nobody would read anything that you would write. Yeah, there's always those killjoys, you know. I heard it really termed very, very well several years ago. It's called a hope sucker outer. The person that puts the vacuum cleaner hose up to somebody's head and they suck out all hope. You know, forget those people. Just start writing. Don't worry about what it looks like. Don't go back and edit it. Just start writing. And then when you get finished, look at it and then worry from that point forward the mechanics. Are you going to self-publish or are you going to go down the route and try to find a agent and maybe one of the big publishing houses will decide to take you on?
That's exactly my word of advice. Just conscious of stream, just type, type, type. I just went
Hmm.
on a week-long book retreat myself, working on my next book, and that's all I did for 6 days straight. I just
Cool.
typed. I didn't format. I didn't spelling, nothing. I just typed. That's all I
Yeah,
did for 6 days straight. Yeah.
that's great. My writing coach, she said, Rick, she said one thing that you can do to help you overcome a writing block is set a reasonable minimum number of words that you want to write each time you sat down. And I think I set it at like 1250. And most of the time yeah, all the time I went over that, but it was just knowing, there was a benchmark in there. So my recommendation too is for people is set yourself a reasonable limit. It might be 750 words. That might sound like a lot. Without, I used to do writing exercises for the people on my shift, and some of them hated it. They said, "Why are we doing this?" I said, "I'll tell you why. Because you got to write reports, and if you write a report that looks like it was written by a second grader, and that thing gets called into court, that attorney's going to make you look like an idiot." You know, and so I'd set 750 word minimum, and a lot of guys said, "Wow, I that's not as many words as I thought." So for somebody who wants to write, if you set a 750 word minimum when you sit down, most likely they're going to exceed that.
That's cool. Yeah. Mm. I don't think I've ever heard any fire service doing some writing practice at the station. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a great idea. So as we come to a wrap here, kind of tell us a little bit about your business that you've kind of launched since retirement and kind of who you're serving and what it's doing in your life personally.
Well, I think you've probably seen our two conversations now. I love working with firefighters and I love the fire service. And I've got a class called The Art of Decision Making, and that's a standalone, but I also couple that with the situational awareness at the command level. And I've got some gigs scheduled this year where I'm teaching both of those. And that's an area where I think that there's a gap in the fire service as well as the rapid tactical decision making and the situational awareness of doing a lot of study on line of duty deaths and the time frames from arrival to when there's a Mayday declared. And so I really have a deep-seated desire to get these lessons learned out there and what I have learned from decision making. I did two research papers on those topics when I was at the executive fire officer program. And the most recent book, well, Chief Leave was one of them, 30 fires you must know. Uh, I'll tell you, there's some heart-wrenching stories in there and we must do a better job. And so that is one of, my motivations with my business, is reaching firefighters either on the individual level or at the department level. I love mentoring firefighters and fire officers. I love coaching them. But I don't know if you have experienced this or not, but the aspect of coaching in the fire service can be a very, very foreign concept because we look at it, and I mean, there's even fire service books written called Coaching and Counseling. And we look at it from the standpoint, hey, spring training's taking place right now. And so we tend to look at that coaching from the pitching coach, the hitting coach, and those type of things, and versus the pure coaching, the where we're sitting down and asking them questions and drawing it out from them. But and then the mentoring, I believe the two go hand in hand, and that's what I love doing with my business. And right now, since Well, I'd say last August, I've been pushing very heavily the art of decision making and situational awareness at the command level.
Love it. Yeah, coaching in the fire service is a game changer. It's like,
Mm,
to me, we can see so much, growth by incorporating a
yeah,
coaching mindset, a coaching approach to leadership in the fire service. And that's
yeah,
my mission moving
absolutely.
forward is bringing coaching to the fire service. I think it should
Yeah,
be in every organization. I think every fighter who's going to be a chief or an officer should have a coach in their back pocket.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I wish that when I was on the job, I knew then what I know now about coaching. And what I know now about coaching, I attribute it to my being part of the Maxwell leadership team, that's where I got certified as a coach through there. And what I have learned, well, May will be 5 years, is man, if I had this information then, Chief, when I was on the job, I believe I would have been so much more effective.
Let's come to a close, Chief. Is there one message or one question that you wish I asked you that I never asked you?
We've had a good conversation here. I
Yeah.
appreciate the
Yeah.
questions that you have asked, and we briefly, touched on chief officers getting out into the fire stations. So my message right here is specifically to chiefs, with a follow on to captains or lieutenants, however your organization is structured. Chiefs, don't be that bad example that the people below you never want to promote up to the chief officer's level. Be the good example. Be the good leader. Be the operationally strong chief officer as well. Be out there in the stations. If you're a volunteer, spend time with the people that are in the organization, however that command structure is. Set things up that where people look and they say, I want to become a battalion chief. The conversation that I had with those two captains out there in Southern California, and I asked, what if you are different? What if you are different than the bad examples that you have? So, chiefs, just because we get a white shirt and a gold badge doesn't make us leaders. It makes us an authority figure. So be that good example.
I love that because there's so many. I've heard examples as well of people saying, I never want to become a chief. Like
Mm.
the amount of time you have to work, the stress you have, the
Mm.
less pay that you have because you don't work overtime, all this stuff is like, we got to fix that problem because we're going to be in trouble in 5, 10 years from now.
Oh, yeah, I think we're
Yeah.
in trouble right now.
Yeah. That very well could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, Chief, it's been an honor chatting with you and getting to know
Oh,
you a little
thank you.
deeper. And
Yeah.
thanks for sharing your wisdom with the world today. How can people connect with you, Chief?
Oh, yeah. People can connect with me. My website is fireofficerleadershipacademy.com. I'm on LinkedIn as Rick Davis, and my email is rick@fireofficerleadershipacademy.com. I'd love to hear from people. Absolutely love talking to firefighters. And if they're local, sit down, get a cup of coffee.
How about your podcast and your book? Can you get it on most platforms or?
Yes, yes. Thank you. My book is available on Amazon, and the podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, and iHeartRadio.
Fantastic. Well, Chief, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. You definitely
Welcome.
have fire running through your blood. Almost 40 years in the fire service. So congratulations and thanks for your
Thank you.
service
Uh,
in both careers you had. So
well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Chief.
fantastic. All right, everyone. Hopefully you got a nugget or two out of this hour of wisdom about how to be a better person, lead with character, and just make that movement. Invest in yourself
Mm.
wisely with the hardest skills, which is the communication, the emotional intelligence, social intelligence, all those things. Spend some time on that. So until next time, stay well. All right, that's a wrap.
All right. Cool. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to Beneath the Helmet. We hope that this podcast has provided you with valuable insights into the world of firefighters' health and wellness. Remember, caring for your physical, mental, and spiritual well-being is crucial to achieving optimal performance. Join us next time on Beneath the Helmet for more inspiring conversations. Until then, stay well.